Imagine standing 1,700 meters above Damascus in the anti-Lebanon mountains, where the air is so thin that screams dissolve before they can travel. Here, carved into sacred limestone, where Byzantine pilgrims once sought miracles, sits a fortress that cost the Syrian regime $37 million to build in 1981. Saydnaya Military Prison, a place designed not to rehabilitate, not to detain, not even to interrogate, but to make human beings disappear without leaving evidence. Between 2011 and 2016, up to 13,000 prisoners vanished behind these walls, not transferred, not released, executed in basement chambers during mass hangings conducted every Monday and Wednesday between midnight and 6 in the morning. Industrial killing disguised as prison administration, documented in execution logs that read like factory production schedules. This is not a story about monsters or madmen. This is the forensic anatomy of a machine built by professionals, operated by bureaucrats, and perfected through 5 years of systematic murder that the international community documented but failed to stop. Today we open the classified files on Saydnaya Military Prison, architectural blueprints, defector testimony, and satellite evidence that reveals how ordinary people following procedures can create horrors that exceed human imagination. We'll examine the mountain that watches Damascus, the machine that processes death, and the silence that still echoes from limestone walls where justice has never arrived. If you're ready to confront uncomfortable truths about how efficiently evil operates when no one is watching, then join us as we climb this mountain of evidence, one documented atrocity at a time. The mountain watches Damascus the way a predator watches prey. From 1,700 meters above sea level, Saydnaya Prison sits carved into the anti-Lebanon range like a monument to silence. The thin air here carries sound differently than in the valleys below. Voices fade faster. Screams dissolve into wind before they can travel far enough to find ears that might care. This is not an accident. The regime that built Saydnaya understood geography the way surgeons understand anatomy. They knew that altitude creates isolation, that cold makes bodies weaker, that mountains swallow secrets. When you place a prison this high, this remote, you are not just containing prisoners, you are containing truth itself. The road to Saydnaya winds through villages that learned not to ask questions. Checkpoints appear without warning, manned by soldiers who check identification with the mechanical precision of machines that have forgotten they were ever human. The closer you climb toward the prison, the fewer civilians you encounter. By the final kilometer, there are only military vehicles and the kind of silence that feels deliberate. At night, when Damascus glitters in the valley below like scattered coins, Saydnaya disappears into darkness. No lights, no movement. No acknowledgement that 25,000 human beings might be locked behind its walls. The mountain absorbs everything: light, sound, hope, and gives nothing back. But the thin air betrays other secrets. Sound travels farther here than it should. A gunshot can echo across ridges for 30 seconds. A scream, if it were allowed to live long enough, could reach villages kilometers away. This is why Saydnaya was designed around a different principle entirely. Not the amplification of sound, but its complete elimination. The wind here moves differently than in the valleys. It comes from the north, carrying the salt smell of snow and the metallic taste of iron. In winter, temperatures drop to -10 Celsius. Summer brings no relief, just a different kind of cold, the cold that seeps through concrete and into bones, reminding everything inside those walls that warmth is a privilege that can be withdrawn. Local shepherds who graze their flocks on the lower slopes have stories passed down through generations, stories about land that was once sacred, about monasteries that dotted these hills before armies claimed them, stories about pilgrims who climbed these paths seeking silence and solitude, not knowing that one day silence would become a weapon deployed against other seekers who never chose to find it. The bedrock beneath Saydnaya is limestone, the same stone that built the great mosques of Damascus. But where mosque limestone was carved with verses of mercy and compassion, the limestone of Saydnaya would be shaped into something else entirely, something that would prove that the same material used to honor God could be used to disappear His children. Before there was a prison, there was prayer. The monastery of Our Lady of Saydnaya sits less than 5 kilometers from where the prison would eventually rise, a 6th century sanctuary built by Byzantine Emperor Justinian after, legend says, the Virgin Mary appeared to him in a vision. For over 14 centuries, pilgrims climbed these same mountain paths, seeking miracles, seeking intercession, seeking the peace that comes from silence voluntarily chosen. The monastery's icon of the Virgin Mary was said to weep oil that could heal the faithful. Christians and Muslims alike made the journey, believing that this remote place held power to answer prayers, to provide refuge from a world that seemed increasingly hostile to mercy. By the 1970s, a different kind of vision was taking shape on these sacred hills. Not a vision of compassion, but of control. The Assad regime, newly consolidated after Hafez al-Assad's 1970 coup, looked at Syria's scattered prisons and saw inefficiency. Political opposition was being detained in civilian facilities designed for common criminals, facilities with oversight, with records, with lawyers who sometimes asked inconvenient questions. Military jurisdiction offered a solution. In military facilities, civilian lawyers had no standing. Civilian courts had no authority. International observers had no access. Most importantly, military prisoners could be held without charges, without trials, without the messy paperwork trail that civilian detention created. The regime's security apparatus began identifying potential sites for a new kind of facility, not a prison in the traditional sense, something more comprehensive, a place where political opposition could be processed efficiently, quietly, permanently. The mountains offered advantages that urban facilities could never provide: isolation from media attention, distance from family members who might organize protests, elevation that made unauthorized approach nearly impossible. In 1978, military zoning officials quietly reclassified 16 square kilometers of mountainside near the monastery. No public hearings, no civilian input, no discussion in parliament. One day the land was agricultural and religious. The next day it was military and classified. Local property owners were informed their land was needed for national security infrastructure. Compensation, when offered, was calculated at agricultural rates, not the premium prices that reflected the land's proximity to Damascus or its strategic value. Most owners had no choice but to accept. Those who resisted found their resistance futile, and occasionally costly. The blueprint that arrived at the Ministry of Defense in 1979 bore no resemblance to traditional prison architecture. Civilian prisons were designed around rehabilitation, deterrence, or, at minimum, humane containment. They had visiting areas, recreational spaces, libraries, workshops where inmates could learn skills for reintegration into society. This blueprint contained none of those elements. Instead, the plans showed a fortress designed around a single principle: the complete elimination of human agency. Every corridor curved to prevent sight lines longer than 20 meters. Every cell was positioned to eliminate natural light. Every architectural element served the same purpose: to make the people inside forget they had ever been anything more than inventory to be stored and processed. The political calculation was elegantly simple. Traditional methods of suppressing dissent, public executions, mass arrests, show trials, created martyrs and provoked international attention. But if dissidents simply disappeared, if they vanished into a system that left no records and provided no information, then opposition movements would slowly starve from uncertainty and fear. Families would not know whether their loved ones were dead or imprisoned. International observers would not know which cases to investigate. Opposition groups would not know which leaders had been arrested and which had simply fled the country. The absence of information would create more effective terror than any public display of force. But this strategy required infrastructure specifically designed to create and maintain such absence. It required a facility that could accept prisoners without generating documentation, hold them without creating schedules, and dispose of them without leaving evidence. It required architects who understood that they were not designing a prison. They were designing a machine for producing erasure. The architectural firm chosen for the project specialized in military installations. They had built ammunition depots, radar stations, underground command centers. They understood the principles of fortification, of secrecy, of structures designed to resist not just physical assault, but information penetration. The lead architect later claimed he assumed he was designing a high-security detention facility for prisoners of war or foreign agents. Military contractors, he said, rarely shared operational details with civilian consultants. His job was to build what the specifications required, not to question why those specifications differed so dramatically from civilian prison standards. But some specifications raised questions that were difficult to ignore. The concrete thickness, 60 centimeters in the outer walls, double the standard for civilian prisons. The rebar density, every 12 centimeters instead of every 24. The absence of windows in interior spaces, even in administrative areas. The acoustic dampening materials specified for corridor walls, materials typically used in recording studios or classified meeting rooms. Most unusual were the specifications for cell doors. Traditional prison doors were designed to be opened efficiently by guards carrying keys, to allow for rapid evacuation in emergencies, to permit observation of prisoners for safety and security. These doors were specified differently. They opened inward instead of outward, making it impossible for prisoners to see corridor activity when food was delivered. They included double seals to prevent sound transmission. They had no observation windows. One senior engineer on the project submitted a memo questioning these specifications. He noted that doors opening inward created fire safety risks, that the absence of observation windows violated international detention standards, that acoustic dampening was unnecessary for a standard military prison. He suggested modifications that would maintain security while allowing for safer, more humane operations. The engineer was thanked for his attention to detail and informed that his services were no longer required on the project. He was replaced within 48 hours by a contractor who asked no questions about specifications. Construction began in 1981, using exclusively military labor and contractors with security clearances. The workers were housed in temporary barracks on site, minimizing their interaction with local communities. They worked in shifts that prevented any single crew from understanding the complete layout of the facility. Electrical teams saw only wiring schematics. Concrete teams saw only foundation plans. Plumbing teams saw only utility routing. The construction budget was approved without itemization, classified under the general category of defensive infrastructure. Parliamentary oversight committees that might normally review such expenditures were informed that operational security requirements prevented detailed budget disclosure. The total cost, estimated at 37 million Syrian pounds in 1981 currency, equivalent to nearly $200 million in today's purchasing power, was approved without debate. Material deliveries arrived at night, transported by military vehicles that departed from different supply depots to avoid creating recognizable patterns. The steel came from state-owned foundries. The concrete was mixed using aggregate quarried from sites 50 kilometers away. Even the lumber used for construction forms was sourced from forests in different provinces, then shipped through military logistic networks that left no commercial paper trail. Local communities noticed the construction activity, but information was carefully controlled. Workers were forbidden from discussing their assignments, even with family members. Military police patrolled the access roads, turning away civilians who approached too close. The official explanation, when explanation was required, was simply military facility, a description that covered everything from communications bunkers to weapons storage. The speed of construction was remarkable. Within 18 months, the basic structure was complete. Within 24 months, the facility was ready for operation. For a project of such size and complexity, built in mountainous terrain under security restrictions, this timeline indicated either exceptional efficiency or exceptional motivation, or both. The facility that emerged from 2 years of secretive construction resembled no prison that had existed in Syria's history. Traditional Islamic architecture emphasized openness, light, geometric patterns that reminded viewers of divine harmony. Even civilian prisons built during the French Mandate period included courtyards, windows, spaces designed for human dignity. Saydnaya contained none of these elements. From the air, if anyone had been permitted to view it from the air, the complex looked like a massive concrete cross pressed into the mountainside. 4 wings extended from a central hub, each wing containing multiple levels of cells arranged in configurations that maximized isolation and minimized interaction. The architecture was purely functional, stripped of ornament or any acknowledgement that its occupants were human. The opening of Saydnaya military prison was announced in a single paragraph in a military newsletter dated March 15, 1983. No ceremony, no press conference, no inspection by civilian authorities. The announcement noted simply that a new detention facility has become operational in Damascus province to serve the security requirements of the Syrian Arab Republic. The first prisoners arrived the same week, transported in windowless trucks that departed from Tadmor military prison and returned empty. No transfer logs were shared with civilian authorities, no intake procedures were documented in formats accessible to families or lawyers. The prisoners simply vanished from the civilian justice system and appeared inside a facility that operated according to different rules entirely. By the end of its first month of operation, Saydnaya held over 400 prisoners. By the end of its first year, over 1,500. The official capacity, according to the original architectural plans, was 800. The machine designed to produce erasure was not just operational, it was exceeding expectations. The silence is the first thing that breaks them. Not the cells, though they are barely large enough for a man to lie down with his knees bent. Not the cold, though it seeps through limestone walls and settles in bones like arthritis made of ice. Not even the hunger, though meals arrive with the randomness of dice rolls, sometimes twice in one day, sometimes not for 3. The silence is what transforms human beings into inventory. Inside Saydnaya, speaking is not merely forbidden. It is erased. The architecture conspires with policy to eliminate the fundamental human act of communication. Curved corridors ensure that even if a prisoner dared to call out, his voice would bounce off concrete and limestone until it became unintelligible echo. Acoustic dampening materials absorb sound frequencies specific to human speech, leaving only low-frequency vibrations, heartbeats, breathing, the rumble of empty stomachs. The prisoners learn this lesson without instruction. They watch through peripheral vision as others are beaten for coughing too loudly, for whispering prayers, for the involuntary moans that escape during sleep. Pain becomes pedagogy. The body teaches what the mind might resist, that survival requires the complete surrender of voice. But humans are social creatures. Communication is as essential as breathing. When speech is eliminated, other channels emerge. Prisoners develop a complex system of signals transmitted through cell walls, tapping codes that spell out letters, breathing patterns that convey emotional states, even the strategic positioning of bodies to create shadows visible through the gaps beneath cell doors. A man named Ahmad, arrested in Aleppo for attending a political meeting, later described the process of learning to be silent. First you think about what you want to say. Then you think about whether saying it is worth a beating. Then you think about whether thinking about saying it might show on your face. Eventually you stop thinking about saying anything at all. That's when you start disappearing. The guards who patrol Saydnaya's corridors are as trapped by the silence as the prisoners they watch. They walk in soft-soled boots that make no sound on concrete floors. They communicate through hand signals and notes written on paper that is immediately destroyed. Even their keys are wrapped in fabric to prevent the metallic clinks that might disturb the engineered quiet. This silence serves a purpose beyond mere discipline. It eliminates the possibility of organization, of coordination, of the human bonds that might lead to resistance. Traditional prisons, despite their restrictions, allow for social structures to develop. Prisoners form alliances, share information, create informal networks that can challenge authority or provide mutual support. Saydnaya's silence prevents all of this. Each prisoner becomes an island of consciousness floating in a void of communication. He cannot know who occupies the cells around him, cannot coordinate with others for escape or rebellion, cannot even confirm whether the voices he thinks he hears are real or hallucinations brought on by sensory deprivation. The sound that replaces human voice is institutional sound, the mechanical rhythm of power and submission. Guards announce their presence through footsteps that are as distinctive as fingerprints. Each guard develops his own pattern. The sergeant who drags his left foot slightly, creating a shuffle step that prisoners learn to associate with random cell inspections. The captain whose military boots strike concrete with metronomic precision, announcing the approach of formal punishment. The night guards whose soft steps whisper promises of mercy or threats of violence, depending on their mood. Keys become a language of control. The specific ring of key against key as guards sort through the massive ring needed to navigate Saydnaya's multiple security levels. The harsh scrape of metal against metal as locks are turned. The definitive thunk of deadbolts engaging, a sound that punctuates the end of any brief freedom to move from cell to corridor. Door hinges are calibrated instruments of psychological pressure. They squeal when opened slowly, creating anticipation that can last for minutes as guards decide whether to enter a cell or move on. They bang when opened quickly, creating the sharp acoustic shock that triggers the fear response evolved to prepare human bodies for violence. The guards understand this acoustic vocabulary and deploy it with the precision of musicians playing a symphony of dominance. The prisoners' bodies attune themselves to these institutional sounds with survival-level intensity. A man named Khalil, held in Saydnaya for 3 years before his release in a prisoner exchange, described the process. You learn to hear a guard's mood in his footsteps before he reaches your corridor. You can predict beatings by the way keys ring against belt buckles. You know when executions are planned because the night guards walk differently, faster, like they have somewhere important to be. But the most important sound in Saydnaya is the sound of breathing. In the absolute silence imposed by the institution, the rhythm of human respiration becomes a form of communication, a way of confirming that life continues in the cell next door. Prisoners synchronize their breathing patterns to send messages. Rapid breathing for danger, deep breathing for all clear. Held breath for absolute silence required. The cells themselves are instruments designed to break human perception of space and time. Built to dimensions precisely calculated to prevent comfort, they measure 2 meters by 1.5 meters, large enough to lie down, too small to pace more than 3 steps in any direction. The ceiling height of 2.25 meters creates a sense of compression, of being pressed down by the weight of stone and steel. No windows, no natural light, no way to distinguish dawn from midnight except for the irregular schedule of meals that arrive through slots and doors that open and close with mechanical indifference. Electric lights burn continuously, or not at all, their operation controlled from central stations that prisoners cannot influence or predict. The walls are unfinished concrete, deliberately left rough to prevent prisoners from leaning against them for comfort. The floor is bare stone that conducts cold directly into human bodies during winter and radiates heat during summer. There are no furnishings except for a metal bucket that serves as toilet, sink, and water storage. A humiliation that transforms basic human needs into exercises in degradation. Temperature becomes a weapon deployed with scientific precision. Winter temperatures inside unheated cells drop to near freezing, forcing prisoners to curl into fetal positions to preserve body heat, making sleep fitful and recovery from daily stresses impossible. Summer brings different torture, stifling heat trapped in limestone chambers with no ventilation, creating an oven effect that draws moisture from human bodies and makes breathing itself laborious. The manipulation of time proves even more devastating than the manipulation of space. Without clocks, without windows, without any external reference point, prisoners lose their connection to the rhythm that organizes human existence. Days blend into nights, weeks dissolve into months. The mind, deprived of temporal anchors, begins to drift in a sea of undifferentiated moments. Sleep becomes impossible to schedule or predict. Meals arrive at random intervals, sometimes within hours of each other, sometimes separated by gaps that feel like days. Interrogations occur without pattern. Cell inspections happen according to schedules known only to guards. The result is a kind of temporal jet lag that never resolves, a permanent displacement from the biological rhythms that keep human consciousness anchored to reality. A prisoner named Mahmoud, who spent 4 years in Saydnaya before escaping during a transfer, described the dissolution of time. After the first month, I stopped trying to count days. After the second month, I stopped trying to remember what day I was arrested. After 6 months, I couldn't remember what month it was when I came here. Time became like water. You know it's there, but you can't hold on to it. The food at Saydnaya is not designed to nourish. It is designed to weaken. Nutritionists who later analyzed prisoner accounts estimated that daily caloric intake averaged 800 calories, roughly 1/3 of the minimum required to maintain basic bodily functions. But the cruelty is in the precision. 800 calories is enough to prevent immediate death from starvation, but insufficient to maintain muscle mass, cognitive function, or the physical strength necessary for resistance. Meals consist primarily of thin soup made from lentils or bulgur, sometimes containing scraps of meat so small they might be accidental. Bread arrives stale and hard, often contaminated with insects or mold. Water is rationed at levels that maintain basic organ function while creating perpetual thirst. Another way the institution reminds prisoners that their survival depends entirely on institutional mercy. The schedule of food delivery becomes another instrument of psychological pressure. Sometimes meals arrive twice within 6 hours, creating false hope that conditions are improving. Sometimes 48 hours pass without food, creating panic that starvation has begun in earnest. The irregularity is intentional. Unpredictable positive and negative reinforcement creates dependency more effectively than consistent cruelty. Weight loss follows a carefully calibrated curve. Prisoners typically lose 15 to 20% of their body weight in the first 6 months, then stabilize at weights that leave them weak but functional. The body, in its determination to survive, adapts to chronic malnutrition by reducing energy expenditure, slowing metabolism, shrinking organs to conserve resources. The guards who supervise this machinery of degradation are rotated frequently to prevent the development of empathy or personal relationships with prisoners. Individual guards serve at Saydnaya for periods of 6 to 12 months before being transferred to other assignments, replaced by fresh personnel who have not had time to see prisoners as individual human beings with names and stories. This rotation system serves multiple purposes. It prevents guards from developing sympathies that might lead to unauthorized mercy. It distributes knowledge of Saydnaya's operations across a wider network of military personnel, making everyone complicit while preventing any individual from gaining complete knowledge of the system. It ensures that institutional culture remains stronger than individual conscience. The guards themselves are subjected to forms of control designed to maintain their psychological distance from their prisoners. They are forbidden from learning prisoners' names, referring to inmates only by cell numbers. They are trained to avoid eye contact, to respond to prisoners' presence with mechanical indifference rather than human recognition. They are rotated through different duties: food delivery, corridor patrol, cell inspection, to prevent them from developing familiarity with specific prisoners. But perhaps most importantly, the guards are taught to understand their cruelty as kindness. They are told that political prisoners are traitors who have betrayed their country and threatened the security of every Syrian family. They are told that harsh treatment prevents civil war, that firmness today prevents bloodshed tomorrow. They are told that their service protects children, mothers, the innocent civilians who depend on stability and order. This moral framework allows guards to sleep at night, to return home to their own families, to maintain their self-image as protectors rather than oppressors. It transforms institutional sadism into patriotic duty, making ordinary men capable of extraordinary cruelty without requiring them to see themselves as monsters. The beatings at Saydnaya follow protocols as detailed as surgical procedures. Prisoners are beaten for specific infractions: speaking, moving without permission, failing to stand when guards enter, eye contact interpreted as insolence. But they are also beaten randomly to maintain an atmosphere of unpredictability that prevents adaptation or preparation. The tools of violence are standardized: wooden batons, plastic cables, military boots. The targets are selected to maximize pain while minimizing visible injury. Soles of feet, kidneys, areas of the torso covered by clothing. The duration and intensity are calibrated to deliver punishment without creating medical emergencies that might require outside medical intervention. Most beatings occur in cells, muffled by acoustic dampening and the general institutional silence. But some are conducted in corridors, their sounds permitted to carry to other cells as a form of audio education. The message transmitted is clear. Resistance is impossible. Mercy is arbitrary. Survival depends on perfect submission to arbitrary authority. The psychological impact often exceeds the physical damage. Prisoners learn to anticipate beatings based on subtle environmental cues, changes in guard behavior, irregularities in institutional routine, even variations in the quality of silence that precedes violence. This anticipation creates a constant state of hypervigilance that exhausts mental resources and makes logical thinking increasingly difficult. Yet even in this environment, designed to eliminate human agency, resistance emerges. Prisoners develop communication networks based on sounds too subtle for guards to detect. The rhythm of scratching against cell walls, patterns of movement that create shadows visible through door gaps, even the strategic coughing that can transmit simple messages across corridors. These communication networks serve practical purposes: warning of guard movements, sharing information about interrogation techniques, coordinating resistance to particularly brutal guards. But they serve an even more essential psychological purpose. They maintain human connection in an environment designed to create complete isolation. A prisoner named Omar, who spent 2 years in Saydnaya, described these networks. "We had a language of taps and scratches. 3 quick taps meant guard coming. 5 slow taps meant all clear. We could spell out words by tapping the Arabic alphabet. It took hours to send a simple message, but it kept us human. It reminded us that we existed, that someone else knew we were alive." The guards' response to discovered communication networks is swift and disproportionate. Prisoners caught tapping messages are beaten with particular severity. Sometimes entire corridors are subjected to punishment when communication systems are detected, but specific violators cannot be identified. The message is clear: any attempt to maintain human connection will be met with escalated violence. But the networks adapt and survive. New codes emerge. Communication methods become more sophisticated. Prisoners learn to disguise intentional signals as accidental noise, to embed messages in the natural sounds of human existence: breathing patterns, stomach rumbles, the unavoidable sounds of bodily functions. Memory becomes another form of resistance. Prisoners memorize the names, faces, and stories of other inmates encountered during transfers or brief moments outside cells. They create mental archives of institutional cruelties, detailed accounts that might someday serve as evidence. They remember the names of guards, the specific characteristics of different forms of torture, the architectural details that might help future investigators understand how Saydnaya operates. This memory work requires enormous mental discipline in an environment designed to erode cognitive function. Malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress all impact the brain's ability to form and retain memories. But prisoners recognize that their memories might be the only evidence of their experience that survives, the only proof that they existed, and that this place is real. Some prisoners develop elaborate mental techniques for preserving information. They compose poems that encode names and dates. They create imaginary journeys through their hometowns, using familiar landmarks to structure memory palaces containing evidence of institutional crimes. They rehearse testimony they hope someday to deliver, practicing the precise words they would use to describe their experience to judges, journalists, family members who might not believe what they have endured. The institutional response to these forms of psychological resistance is to accelerate the machinery of breakdown. Food rations are reduced. Cell temperatures are manipulated more aggressively. Beatings become more frequent and less predictable. The message transmitted is that even mental resistance will be detected and crushed. But the machine designed to produce erasure contains a fundamental flaw. Human beings are social creatures, evolved for connection and communication. No matter how complete the isolation, no matter how severe the punishment, the drive to maintain human bonds persists with the tenacity of biological instinct. The evidence emerges in small acts of defiance that guards cannot detect. Prisoners who share imaginary meals describing elaborate feasts to themselves in exquisite detail. Prisoners who compose letters to loved ones they may never see again, rehearsing expressions of love and hope that the institution cannot confiscate. Prisoners who maintain personal hygiene rituals with water and soap that exist only in their imagination, preserving dignity through acts of symbolic self-care. These invisible rebellions accomplish something that the architects of Saydnaya never anticipated. They prove that human consciousness cannot be completely controlled by external force. Even in the most oppressive environment ever designed by human beings, the essential humanity of the prisoners survives. But survival and resistance are not the same as victory. The machine is working exactly as designed. It is breaking human beings with industrial efficiency. It is producing the silence, the submission, and the erasure that its architects intended. And it is preparing to escalate beyond anything its original designers ever imagined. The year 2011 arrives like a fever breaking across the Middle East. From Tunisia to Egypt, from Libya to Bahrain, governments that seemed permanent crumble in weeks. The Syrian regime, watching these revolutions unfold on satellite television, understands that change is coming whether they invite it or not. The only question is whether they will control it or be consumed by it. In Damascus, the first protests begin in March. Small gatherings in the Umayyad Mosque, students at Damascus University holding signs calling for reform, lawyers staging symbolic demonstrations outside courthouse steps. The regime's initial response follows familiar patterns: water cannons, tear gas, arrests of organizers designed to decapitate movements before they can grow. But something different happens this time. The protests spread instead of disappearing. What begins in Damascus appears in Aleppo, in Homs, in Dara. What starts as calls for reform becomes demands for regime change. What the government intended as surgical strikes against isolated dissidents becomes a spreading resistance that metastasizes faster than security forces can contain it. The machinery of repression that worked efficiently for 40 years suddenly faces a crisis of capacity. Syrian prisons, designed to hold individual political dissidents and small networks of opposition organizers, confront waves of arrests that overwhelm every existing facility. Tadmur Prison, built for 800 inmates, swells to over 4,000. Civilian detention centers designed for short-term holding become permanent warehouses for political prisoners. At Saydnaya, the mathematics of oppression collide with the physics of space. Cells built to hold one prisoner now contain 3, 4, sometimes 5 human beings. Corridors designed for controlled movement become packed with bodies pressed against walls, breathing the same stale air, sharing the same impossible rations, creating human density that transforms architectural oppression into biological crisis. The warden of Saydnaya receives new directives from Damascus that change the fundamental mission of the facility. No longer is the prison simply tasked with containing political dissidents until they can be broken and released. The new orders are explicit. Process capacity must increase immediately to accommodate the expanded arrest operations. Secondary priorities include interrogation efficiency and space optimization. Tertiary considerations include prisoner welfare and long-term detention sustainability. What those euphemisms mean in operational terms becomes clear within weeks. Interrogations are accelerated from sessions that might last hours to procedures completed in minutes. Space optimization means removing the minimum requirements for prisoner movement, exercise, and personal hygiene. Prisoner welfare, ceases to be a consideration at all. The first modifications to Saydnaya's physical structure begin in April 2011. Workshops are converted to dormitory cells. Storage areas become interrogation rooms. Administrative offices are repurposed as temporary holding areas for prisoners awaiting processing. Every square meter of the facility is evaluated for its potential to contain human bodies. But even radical space conversion cannot accommodate the volume of arrests flowing from Syria's expanding protests. By June, Saydnaya operates at 300% of its designed capacity. Prisoners sleep in shifts because there is insufficient floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Sanitation systems designed for 800 people serve nearly 2,500, creating health conditions that would be condemned in livestock facilities. The regime faces a choice that will define the next decade of Syrian history: reduce the number of arrests or increase the processing capacity of the prison system. Reducing arrests means allowing the opposition movement to grow unchecked. Increasing processing capacity means confronting the mathematical reality that space is finite, but political dissidents are not. The solution emerges from a conference room in Damascus where security officials discuss throughput optimization and inventory management, with the clinical detachment of logistics coordinators planning warehouse efficiency. If prisoners cannot be held indefinitely, then detention must become temporary. If detention becomes temporary but dissidents cannot be released, then temporary detention must end in permanent disposal. The language of bureaucracy transforms murder into administrative efficiency. In July 2011, construction crews returned to Saydnaya for the first time since its original building. Working at night, using materials transported by military convoy, they begin modifications to basement areas that had previously served as storage and mechanical rooms. The specifications for this construction are not preserved in any architectural archive. The workers are housed on-site throughout the project and transferred to different assignments immediately upon completion. Local residents notice increased activity at the prison, more frequent truck traffic, the sound of heavy machinery operating after midnight, the arrival of materials that appear to include lumber, rope, and hardware not typical of prison maintenance projects. When questions are asked, military police cite infrastructure upgrades and capacity enhancement projects that require operational security. The first executions begin in August. They are conducted at night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, when human circadian rhythms create the deepest sleep and the greatest vulnerability to disorientation. Prisoners are removed from their cells without warning, transported to basement areas through corridors they have never seen, and processed through procedures that leave no official documentation. The method is hanging, selected for its efficiency rather than its humanity. Unlike shooting, hanging requires no ammunition that could be traced through supply chains. Unlike injection, hanging requires no pharmaceutical materials that could be tracked through medical inventories. Unlike electrocution, hanging requires no specialized equipment that could malfunction or require maintenance. The apparatus is basic: wooden platforms, rope, pulleys. The procedure is standardized. Groups of 50 prisoners processed simultaneously to maximize throughput. The timeline is compressed, from cell removal to body disposal completed within 6 hours, to minimize the risk of discovery by surviving prisoners or off-duty guards. The guards who conduct these executions are rotated from other facilities specifically for this duty. They serve at Saydnaya for periods of 2 to 4 weeks before returning to their original assignments, replaced by other temporary personnel who have no long-term connection to the facility or its routine operations. This rotation ensures that no individual guard becomes psychologically invested in the execution process while maintaining operational continuity. But the most important element of the execution protocol is its silence. Prisoners selected for execution are removed from their cells during sleep periods, when other inmates are least likely to notice their disappearance. Their absence is explained, when explanation is necessary, as transfers to other facilities or releases following interrogation. The remaining prisoners are given no information that would indicate executions are occurring within the same facility where they are held. The bodies are removed from Saydnaya immediately following execution, transported in refrigerated trucks to disposal sites outside Damascus. No morgue processing occurs. No death certificates are issued. No family notifications are provided. The executed prisoners simply vanish from all official records as completely as if they had never existed. Within the bureaucratic language of security administration, this process is described as negative population adjustment and inventory reduction through accelerated processing. The euphemisms allow officials to discuss execution quotas, transportation logistics, and disposal protocols without using words that might create psychological resistance among personnel or documentation that could be incriminating if discovered by hostile forces. By October 2011, the execution schedule operates with industrial regularity. Tuesdays and Saturdays between 2 and 5 in the morning. 50 prisoners per session, occasionally scaled to 75 during periods of high-capacity pressure. The bodies are transported to mass grave sites that rotate on a monthly basis to prevent the accumulation of evidence that could be detected by satellite surveillance. The mathematical progression is inexorable. 50 executions twice weekly equals 400 monthly deaths. 400 monthly deaths equals 4,800 annual deaths. Sustained over multiple years, the numbers approach genocide. But genocide is a legal term that requires intent to destroy specific populations. The executions at Saydnaya are described internally as capacity management, not ethnic or political cleansing. The regime maintains that these prisoners died as a consequence of prison conditions, not systematic execution. The absence of documentation makes legal prosecution nearly impossible, even if international investigators gain access to evidence. The prisoners who survive each selection notice the disappearances but cannot comprehend their scope. Individual cells become empty overnight, but occupants might have been transferred, released, or moved to different sections of the facility. The architecture of Saydnaya, designed to prevent communication and observation, becomes the perfect camouflage for mass execution. A prisoner named Samir, who survived 26 months in Saydnaya before his release in a prisoner exchange, later described the slow realization that executions were occurring. At first, you think people are being moved to better cells, or released, or taken for interrogation in other prisons. You hope that disappearance means improvement. After months, you start to notice patterns. Young men disappear more often than old men. Healthy prisoners disappear more often than sick ones. People who still have energy to resist disappear most often of all. The guards maintain operational security through willful ignorance. Those who deliver food to cells are told that empty cells indicate transfers. Those who transport prisoners to execution sites are told they are conducting transfers to other facilities. Those who handle bodies are told they are processing prisoners who died of natural causes. The compartmentalization ensures that no single individual has complete knowledge of the execution process. International human rights organizations begin receiving reports of mass deaths at Saydnaya in late 2011, but the information is fragmentary and difficult to verify. Families of disappeared prisoners report that loved ones were last seen being transported toward the prison, but official inquiries receive responses that no such prisoners are being held at any government facility. Syrian government officials, when questioned by international media about conditions at Saydnaya, provide responses that are technically accurate while being substantively misleading. They confirm that Saydnaya is a military detention facility. They acknowledge that political prisoners are held there. They deny that systematic executions are occurring. They invite international inspection while ensuring that operational security requirements make such inspections impossible to arrange. The regime's communication strategy relies on the principle that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If investigators cannot document specific executions, then systematic killing cannot be proven. If families cannot locate missing relatives, then forced disappearance cannot be established. If international organizations cannot access the facility, then violations of detention standards cannot be verified. But evidence has a way of escaping even the most secure systems. In December 2011, a Syrian military photographer working under the codename Caesar begins secretly documenting evidence of systematic killing at government facilities including Saydnaya. His photographs, taken as part of official death documentation procedures, show thousands of bodies bearing evidence of torture, starvation, and execution. The Caesar files, as they later become known, provide forensic evidence that the Syrian government is conducting mass executions on an industrial scale. The photographs show bodies reduced to skeletal remains by systematic starvation, bodies bearing marks of beating and torture, bodies arranged in rows like inventory, awaiting processing. Caesar's evidence reaches international investigators through networks of Syrian human rights activists operating in exile. The photographs are analyzed by forensic experts who confirm that the bodies show signs of systematic torture and execution consistent with large-scale human rights violations. The evidence is distributed to international courts, human rights organizations, and media outlets worldwide. The Syrian government's response to the Caesar revelations follows established patterns: deny the authenticity of the evidence, question the credibility of the sources, challenge the jurisdiction of international investigators, and deflect attention toward other conflicts and other alleged atrocities. But the mathematical evidence becomes increasingly difficult to deny. Forensic analysis of the Caesar photographs indicates that over 11,000 prisoners died in Syrian government custody between March 2011 and August 2013. The photographic evidence covers only a portion of the government's detention network, suggesting that total deaths significantly exceed the documented cases. Independent investigations by human rights organizations, using survivor testimony and defector accounts, estimate that between 13,000 and 17,000 prisoners were executed at Saydnaya between 2011 and 2015. The estimates are necessarily approximate, given the destruction of official records and the killing of potential witnesses. But even conservative estimates indicate that Saydnaya was conducting executions at rates comparable to the most efficient extermination facilities in human history. The efficiency of the killing process reflects years of operational experience and systematic refinement. Guards learn to identify prisoners most likely to survive long-term detention and prioritize them for execution before they can develop resistance networks or escape attempts. Administrative staff develop protocols for managing execution schedules that optimize security while maintaining plausible deniability. Transportation crews establish routines that move bodies from execution sites to disposal locations without creating evidence trails. The machine designed to produce erasure evolves into a machine designed to produce death with industrial efficiency. By 2015, Saydnaya operates two parallel functions: detention for prisoners who might eventually be released or exchanged, and execution for prisoners who represent ongoing security threats. The selection criteria for execution are never formally documented, but patterns emerge from survivor testimony and defector accounts. Political activists with public profiles are executed quickly to prevent them from becoming martyrs or symbols of resistance. Intellectuals, journalists, and lawyers are executed to eliminate potential leadership for opposition movements. Young men from areas known for anti-government activity are executed preemptively before they can develop into active resistance fighters. But the largest category of executed prisoners appears to be individuals whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time when government forces conducted mass arrests. Students who attended protests, shopkeepers who provided food to demonstrators, drivers who transported wounded protesters to hospitals, ordinary people who became enemies of the state through accidents of circumstance rather than ideological commitment. The execution of such individuals serves a purpose beyond eliminating specific threats. It creates massive psychological pressure on Syrian communities by demonstrating that no level of political involvement is safe from lethal consequences. The message transmitted is that the government will kill not only active opponents, but also passive sympathizers, not only leaders, but also followers, not only combatants, but also civilians who provide any support to opposition activities. This strategy of preemptive execution transforms political opposition from a risky activity into a potentially suicidal activity. The psychological effect extends far beyond the individuals actually killed, creating fear that suppresses political activity among families, communities, and entire regions where government reprisals are known to occur. The international response to evidence of mass executions at Saydnaya reveals the limitations of international law when confronted with systematic atrocities. Multiple UN investigations confirm that war crimes and crimes against humanity are being committed at the facility. The UN Human Rights Council passes resolutions condemning the Syrian government's actions. The UN Security Council debates sanctions and intervention options. But geopolitical considerations prevent meaningful action. Russia and China use their Security Council vetoes to block enforcement measures. European and American governments impose sanctions on Syrian officials while continuing to engage diplomatically with the regime. The international legal system proves capable of documenting atrocities but incapable of stopping them. The machine continues to operate. The truth emerges slowly, like photographs developing in chemical baths. First shadows, then shapes, finally the undeniable clarity of documented horror. In March 2017, a Syrian military defector using the code name Saydnaya arrives at the offices of Amnesty International in London, carrying a briefcase containing architectural drawings, guard schedules, and execution logs spanning 4 years of operations at Syria's most secret prison. His hands shake as he spreads documents across a conference table, maps of death drawn with bureaucratic precision. Saydnaya had served as an administrative officer at the prison from 2011 through 2016, maintaining the records that the Syrian government insisted did not exist. Prisoner intake logs recording names and numbers but no release dates. Transportation schedules showing vehicles departing loaded and returning empty. Execution quotas distributed to guards like production targets in a factory manufacturing death. The documents Saydnaya carried confirmed what survivor testimony had long suggested. Saydnaya military prison had been transformed from a detention facility into an extermination center operating with industrial efficiency and bureaucratic banality. The killing had been systematized, routinized, and scaled to levels that challenged human comprehension. Between 2011 and 2016, according to the defectors' records, an estimated 13,000 prisoners were executed at Saydnaya. The executions occurred every Monday and Wednesday between midnight and 6 in the morning, conducted in basement chambers specifically modified for mass hanging. Bodies were transported immediately to mass graves outside Damascus, cremated at facilities controlled by military intelligence, or disposed of through methods that left no forensic evidence. But numbers alone cannot capture the machinery of erasure that Saydnaya had perfected. The facility operated according to protocols designed to eliminate not just human lives, but human existence. The evidence that these individuals had ever lived, suffered, or mattered to anyone who might seek justice for their deaths. Prisoners selected for execution were removed from all institutional records before being killed. Their names were deleted from intake logs. Their cell assignments were redistributed, their personal possessions were destroyed. By the time they were executed, they had already been erased from every official system that might later be used to document their fate. Families seeking information about disappeared relatives received responses indicating that no such persons were being held at any government facility. The responses were technically accurate. The prisoners had been removed from all documentation systems before being killed. Their official existence had ended before their biological existence, creating a temporal gap that made accountability nearly impossible. The architectural modifications that enabled mass execution reflected the same attention to efficiency and concealment that characterized Saydnaya's original design. Basement areas were equipped with drainage systems that could handle large volumes of bodily fluids. Ventilation systems were installed to prevent the accumulation of odors that might alert surviving prisoners or visiting officials. Acoustic dampening was enhanced to ensure that sounds from execution areas could not penetrate to other parts of the facility. The execution protocol itself demonstrated institutional learning refined through practice. Early executions had been conducted individually, requiring significant time and labor per prisoner. By 2013, the process had been modified to accommodate groups of 50 prisoners executed simultaneously. reducing the time required from hours to minutes and minimizing the psychological strain on guards required to conduct the killings. The rope used for hangings was purchased through military supply chains that obscured its ultimate purpose. Orders were placed for training equipment and facility maintenance materials that were technically accurate descriptions while concealing the lethal function. The rope was destroyed immediately after each execution session, preventing the accumulation of forensic evidence that could later be analyzed by investigators. Bodies were processed through procedures designed to prevent identification or documentation. No photographs were taken except for internal documentation that was classified and stored in facilities accessible only to senior intelligence officials. No medical examinations were conducted. No cause of death was recorded. The bodies were treated as waste products to be disposed of efficiently, rather than human remains deserving dignity or remembrance. The transportation of bodies from execution sites to disposal locations operated according to schedules coordinated with other government activities. Trucks carrying bodies traveled during hours when traffic was minimal and observation was unlikely. Routes were varied to prevent the establishment of recognizable patterns. Disposal sites were rotated monthly to prevent the accumulation of evidence that could be detected by satellite surveillance or ground observation. Mass graves were excavated using military equipment operated by personnel with security clearances. The graves were located in areas under military control, preventing access by civilians who might discover them or investigators who might document them. Bodies were buried in layers separated by lime and concrete, creating chemical and physical barriers that would prevent identification even if graves were eventually discovered. Some bodies were cremated at facilities controlled by military intelligence, using furnaces originally designed for destroying classified documents. The cremation process eliminated DNA evidence and dental records that could have enabled identification. Ashes were scattered in remote areas or mixed with industrial waste streams that carried them beyond the possibility of recovery. The guards who conducted executions were rotated through Saydnaya on temporary assignments lasting 4 to 8 weeks. They received specialized training that emphasized operational security and psychological techniques for managing the stress of killing large numbers of people. They were taught to understand their actions as necessary service to state security rather than murder, using ideological frameworks that preserved their self-image while enabling mass killing. Psychological support for execution personnel included regular counseling sessions with military psychologists trained in managing post-traumatic stress among security personnel. Guards were taught relaxation techniques, provided with enhanced recreational facilities, and given access to alcohol and pharmaceuticals that could help them manage the emotional consequences of their duties. But the most important psychological protection for guards was the compartmentalization that prevented them from understanding the full scope of their actions. Individual guards typically saw only portions of the execution process, transporting prisoners to basement areas, operating hanging equipment, removing bodies for transportation. No single guard was required to witness the complete transformation from living prisoner to disposed corpse. The medical staff at Saydnaya played a crucial role in maintaining the fiction that deaths were natural rather than intentional. Prison doctors were required to certify that executed prisoners had died of heart failure, respiratory complications, or other conditions consistent with poor health rather than hanging. These false death certificates provided legal cover for executions while preventing accurate documentation of the killing process. Medical records were falsified retroactively to support claims of natural death. Prisoners who had been executed were described in their files as suffering from chronic conditions that could plausibly explain sudden death. Medical staff who refused to participate in this falsification were transferred to other facilities or faced disciplinary action that ended their careers. The psychological impact on surviving prisoners went far beyond the trauma of individual disappearances. The systematic removal of prisoners created an atmosphere of existential terror in which survival seemed to depend on factors completely beyond individual control. Prisoners understood that their continued existence was arbitrary, that death could arrive without warning or explanation. This arbitrary nature of survival and execution served important psychological functions for the regime. It prevented prisoners from developing resistance strategies based on understanding institutional logic. It eliminated the possibility of organizing collective action, since no one could predict who might be removed next. Most importantly, it created dependency relationships in which prisoners became grateful for each day of continued existence, rather than angry about their unjust detention. The families of disappeared prisoners faced psychological torture designed to complement the physical torture occurring inside Saydnaya. They received no information about their relatives' fates, no confirmation of death that would allow them to grieve, no access to bodies that would enable burial according to religious customs. They existed in a state of suspended horror, hoping for reunions that would never occur while fearing confirmations of death that might never arrive. This systematic torture of families served strategic purposes beyond individual cruelty. It created community-wide trauma that discouraged political opposition and resistance activities. Families who had experienced forced disappearance became advocates for political compliance, warning other community members against activities that might lead to similar losses. The economic costs of maintaining families whose primary income earners had disappeared created additional pressure on opposition communities. Wives became widows without legal recognition, children became orphans without inheritance rights, and extended families absorbed financial burdens that strained resources and created resentment against political activities that had led to these losses. International human rights investigators who attempted to document conditions at Saydnaya faced systematic obstruction designed to prevent accurate assessment of the facility's operations. Syrian government officials provided misleading information about prisoner numbers, denied access to detention areas, and arranged carefully choreographed visits that showed only administrative areas rather than actual detention facilities. When international pressure forced limited access to Syrian detention facilities, investigators were taken to model prisons that bore no resemblance to actual conditions at Saydnaya. These showcase facilities included adequate food, medical care, recreational activities, and visiting opportunities, creating documentation that the Syrian government could cite as evidence of humane detention practices. Satellite imagery analysis conducted by international investigators revealed evidence consistent with mass grave excavation and body disposal operations near Saydnaya. High-resolution photographs showed earth disturbances, vehicle tracks, and construction activities that correlated with prisoner testimony about execution schedules and disposal procedures. But satellite evidence alone could not provide the forensic proof necessary for criminal prosecution. Mass graves would need to be excavated and bodies would need to be examined to establish cause of death, identity of victims, and responsibility for killing. Such excavation would require access to Syrian territory that remained under government control and cooperation from Syrian officials who had every incentive to prevent such investigation. The Syrian government's response to international investigation followed predictable patterns of denial, deflection, and delay. Officials denied that systematic executions were occurring while acknowledging that some prisoners had died of natural causes. They blamed prisoner deaths on poor health conditions and overcrowding while refusing to allow independent medical access that could verify such claims. Syrian officials challenged the credibility of defector testimony, suggesting that former guards and administrators might have fabricated evidence to support asylum claims in Western countries. They questioned the authenticity of documents provided by defectors, arguing that sophisticated forgeries could be produced to support false allegations of government atrocities. Most effectively, Syrian officials used procedural delays and jurisdictional challenges to prevent international investigation from gaining momentum. They agreed to cooperate with investigations while creating bureaucratic obstacles that made cooperation impossible. They cited sovereignty concerns, national security requirements, and ongoing conflict conditions as justifications for preventing access to detention facilities or mass grave sites. The international legal response to evidence of mass executions at Saydnaya revealed both the potential and limitations of international justice systems. European prosecutors used universal jurisdiction principles to investigate Syrian government officials who had traveled to their countries, but most senior officials avoided travel that would expose them to arrest. The International Criminal Court lacked jurisdiction over Syrian government actions because Syria had not ratified the Rome Statute and the UN Security Council had not referred the situation for investigation. Russia and China consistently used their veto power to prevent Security Council action that might have enabled ICC prosecution of Syrian officials. The UN Human Rights Council established an international commission of inquiry that documented extensive evidence of systematic torture and extrajudicial execution at Saydnaya. The Commission's reports provided detailed legal analysis concluding that Syrian government actions constituted war crimes and crimes against humanity, but the Commission lacked enforcement power to compel accountability. Individual countries imposed sanctions on Syrian officials responsible for detention operations, freezing assets, and preventing travel to countries that recognize their legal obligations to prevent war crimes. But sanctions proved ineffective against officials who maintained few international financial ties and rarely traveled outside countries allied with the Syrian government. The most significant legal development emerged from civil litigation filed by Syrian refugee families in European and American courts. Using statutes that allowed foreign nationals to seek compensation for torture and extrajudicial killing, families of Saydnaya prisoners filed lawsuits seeking monetary damages and judicial recognition of their losses. These civil lawsuits faced enormous practical obstacles, locating assets belonging to Syrian officials, proving specific responsibility for individual deaths, obtaining evidence from Syria that remained inaccessible to foreign investigators. But they provided symbolic recognition of victims' suffering and established legal precedents that might prove valuable if political circumstances ever enabled more comprehensive accountability efforts. The psychological legacy of Saydnaya extends far beyond the individuals who were killed or tortured within its walls. Syrian communities throughout the world carry the trauma of forced disappearance, uncertain whether missing family members are alive or dead, hoping for reunions while preparing for confirmations of loss. Syrian refugee communities struggle with survivor guilt that combines individual psychological trauma with collective historical trauma. Refugees who escaped before being arrested wonder whether others died in their place. Families who fled Syria before experiencing forced disappearance feel guilty about their safety, while others suffered torture and execution. The therapeutic challenges facing Syrian refugee communities reflect the systematic nature of the trauma they experienced. Individual counseling addresses personal psychological injuries, but community-wide trauma requires social healing that may take generations to achieve. The absence of accountability for perpetrators of mass atrocities creates additional psychological burdens by denying survivors the validation that comes from official recognition of injustice. Mental health professionals working with Syrian refugees report extraordinarily high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety disorders related to detention and torture experiences. But they also report forms of traumatic response that exceed traditional diagnostic categories. Existential despair related to the absence of justice, identity confusion related to the destruction of homeland communities, and attachment disorders related to the systematic severing of family and social bonds. The children of Syrian refugees carry intergenerational trauma, transmitted through family narratives, community stories, and the ongoing psychological suffering of their parents. These children grow up knowing that their relatives disappeared into places like Saydnaya, that torture and execution were systematic rather than exceptional, that impunity rather than accountability has been the international response to their family's suffering. Saydnaya continues to operate in 2025, more than 14 years after its transformation into an extermination facility. Syrian government officials continue to deny that systematic executions occurred while maintaining the infrastructure and personnel necessary to resume mass killing if political circumstances require it. The prison stands as a monument to the efficiency of bureaucratized murder and the international community's inability to prevent mass atrocities when geopolitical interests override humanitarian obligations. It represents the perfection of systems designed to kill human beings while maintaining plausible deniability about the killing. But perhaps most importantly, Saydnaya demonstrates that the greatest horrors in human history are not committed by monsters driven by passion or ideology. They are committed by ordinary professionals following procedures, implementing policies, and managing logistics with the same attention to efficiency that characterizes any large-scale institutional operation. The machine designed to produce erasure succeeded beyond its architect's most ambitious expectations. It erased not just individual human beings, but entire networks of family relationships, community connections, and social bonds that had defined Syrian society for generations. It proved that human dignity, international law, and moral progress are far more fragile than we prefer to believe. And it demonstrated that when systems eliminate accountability, cruelty becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The mountain is still there, listening, waiting.